Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our featured interview for the Big Story Day as part of Black and Genetics Week. I'm Alex, and I'm here with Lynette and Dr. Joseph Graves, who we're hosting for a featured interview today. So just to get us started, I was hoping that Dr. Graves, you could tell us a little bit about yourself. So we'll start pretty basic with the question of being, where are you from? And how did your parents' background influence your educational pursuits?
Okay, so I'm just going to say for all the listeners that you can read that whole story in my newly released biopic called A Voice in the Wilderness. A pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help us solve some of our biggest problems. So chapter 1 is called The Unexpected Path, because there's absolutely nothing in my parents' background that would have predicted that I should end up in a career in science. You know, my mother was born in a sharecropper's cabin in Brunswick County, Virginia. My dad was born in the same county. His people owned land, but they were poor farmers. They grew up through the height of violent Jim Crow in this country. They met after World War II. My father had served in the European theater. In fact, landed on Utah Beach under fire. Was decorated 3 times. My mother was introduced to my father by her brother, Willie, who had served in the Pacific Theater. So that was quite common for African Americans from the South in that time period. They had emigrated to New Jersey, and there was a social club for all of the folks from Virginia who hung out, and that's where my parents met. My father's education was very poor. He could, barely read a newspaper. My mother was slightly better. She went to St. Paul's, which was a historically Black sort of secondary school in that county. But, as you know, those schools did, really rudimentary education. They were mainly designed to prevent Black women from getting pregnant. They really didn't have any higher educational goal than that. Things like being a seamstress or some other rudimentary skill was what was taught there. So, I grew up with working class parents who were deeply faithful people who were in the midst of trying to survive Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. And none of that would have predicted me becoming a scientist.
Wow, that is such a cool story.
Incredible.
So in light with, your highly unlikely, track to becoming a scientist, where did you attend school? Sort of like, what was kind of the first way that you got into the world?
So I started school in Westfield Public Schools, Westfield, New Jersey. My parents made the conscious decision to live in Westfield because it had a very strong public school system, and they very much wanted their kids to take advantage of those opportunities. They could have had a much nicer house in Plainfield, which had a much higher African American population, but Plainfield Public Schools at that time weren't that good, so they wanted to stay in Westfield. Going to Mckinley Elementary School, it was segregated by race and class. It sort of spanned 2 very different types of people, in the sense that one side of the school was populated by people whose parents were professionals, doctors, lawyers, other highly educated people. The other group of students in the school were working class. The street I lived on, Downer Street, had a Black block where the African Americans lived, and then a white block where all the Italians lived. On the corner of the intersection separating the 2 groups was St. Luke's African Methodist Episcopal Church, St. Luke's AME, which had formerly been pastored by Paul Robeson's father. So it was a historic church. Of course, I didn't know any of that at the time. because I attended Bethel Baptist, and so I didn't know anything about AME, period. But the hardest thing for me in elementary school was the assumption held by those running the school of the intellectual inferiority of African American students. So they assumed that we weren't capable of learning in the same way that the European American students could. So I started out in a slow class, and they used tracking in those days. And while they didn't call them that, it was really clear that that's what they had intentioned. So I saw the lessons of the kids in the more advanced tracks, and it's clearly more challenging than what I was being given. I became a behavior problem because I finished my work very quickly, and the teachers didn't know what to do with me, little boy who has nothing to do, so they were going to put me in special education. And I tell a story in the book about a young man in the 1990s who that's exactly what they did. He was intelligent, but they didn't know what to do with him, so they wanted to put him in special education. He ended up dropping out of school. So to my advantage, my mother refused to let them treat me that. She pitched a fit in that. He said, "You're not putting my son in special education." And then a few years later, I was sitting in the library reading a very advanced book. It was a university level textbook in history. And a student teacher noticed what I was reading. And instead of the other teachers who assumed that I was just acting out, getting big books because I couldn't read the ones that were age appropriate, she actually came up to me and asked me, "Little boy, what are you reading?" And then I explained to her the history of the First, Second, Third Crusades, who all the major players were, why they did what they did. And she was just flabbergasted. And literally the next day, they had moved me to the advanced track. And then they realized that they had something on their hands that they really didn't know how to deal with. So, my time in Westville Public Schools was one of, a situation where there were clear expectations of inferiority for persons of African descent. But then when I broke through that ceiling, there were teachers who recognized, hey, this kid's got something special. A lot of them ended up, helping me and being mentors. But of course, there were others who, couldn't get past their implicit bias. So that was the struggle of growing up in the late 1960s, early 1970s, which again, as you know, hides the civil rights movement, Black Power, John Carlos and Tommy Smith in Mexico City, Black Panthers, and all of that was stuff I experienced. And then decided to go to college as a science major.
And what did you study? What was your major? I assume
I
not.
was a biology major in high school. And that's what I was interested in going to college to study. I also had some interest in possibly doing astrophysics. But when I got to Oberlin College, which you probably all know is known for being a politically progressive school, the faculty in the physics department were not welcoming. And, one faculty member pretty much drove me out of continuing in physics, whereas the biology faculty were very supportive. And that's one of the reasons why I finished my degree in biology. Again, all this stuff's in the book. So, your listeners can read more details in the book.
Yes, I'm looking forward to reading that book as well. But so what prompted you to study evolutionary biology, and were there any people along the path who were particularly impactful in you deciding to go that route?
Absolutely. And again, it's a story of contingency. Your readers, again, listeners, because they're not reading this, listeners don't know that, I, again, struggled through my undergraduate preparation for a number of reasons. The main thing just being in a culture that I knew nothing about. I was first generation college student, working class, My classmates were all upper middle class, some of them extremely wealthy, parents had generations of education. So I just didn't know how to navigate college. And, while the advisors, some of them, faculty members had the best intentions, the best of them understood things as the way you would address, African Americans, other non-white students, was through colorblindness. So they didn't understand that I was struggling through things that they really had no understanding of. Again, that's sort of circular, but they just didn't get it. So I had a lot of other things going on, family issues, poverty. Mom was sick. So, I got out of Oberlin with a 2.7 grade point average. Nobody was really looking for me in graduate school. So I ended up going to the University of Lowell, which now is called UMass Lowell. And I ended up working with a faculty member who was interested in the ecology of the transmission of schistosomiasis, which is a tropical disease. And the thing that happened between undergraduate and graduate school was mainly graduate school was interested in different skills. So the things that made me a poor undergraduate student actually made me a great graduate student, because I had seen through the problems of the science I was being taught, and that sort of questioning attitude really served me well when I had to solve real world scientific problems. And again, I talk about this in the book. So I went from somebody who struggled as an undergraduate to being, a 4.3 student on a 4 scale. And so at that point, the question was, where was I going to go for my PhD? Because I was in a master's program at Lowell. And I had settled on 2 schools, either Harvard or Michigan. Michigan had invited me out, tour the campus, and it was a springtime, Big Ten campus. Everything was, popping. I had already pretty much made my mind that I was going to go to Michigan, but I still was interested in going to Harvard because I was planning to work with Richard Lewontin. Now, your listeners should know that Richard Lewontin is one of the great pioneers of population genetics in the latter portion of the 20th century. Now, I'd spoken to Lewontin while I was a grad student at Lowell. He was working on a problem related to what I was doing on my master's project. And, as far as I could tell, he was very interested in me coming to Harvard to work with him. Now, I'd also won the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. And, as you know, these fellowships are very prestigious, and pretty much anyone who gets one gets accepted where they apply, because that program doesn't have to pay for that student. Plus, it's a very prestigious award. So I am probably the only person in history to be turned down from a program with a graduate record fellowship. And again, I tell the story in voice of how I got the letter from Harvard, which made no kind of sense. And literally, I'm paraphrasing here. They said, dear Mr. Graves, we find that your credentials are entirely in line with you attending Harvard University. Then there was the however. However, we can find no faculty member who is willing to take you on as a graduate student. Therefore, we are declining your admission. So, given that I had spoken to Lewontin and I knew he was interested, I was left wondering, what the heck happened here? Now, years later, I found out from his son, who I knew through my work in Science for the People, that his dad basically hadn't been able to make that meeting. So there was no one in the meeting, the graduate meeting, to speak up for me when the graduate students were being reviewed. But still, it really, even if he wasn't there, the idea that they could turn down the only African-American student that they'd probably ever seen for PhD program in evolutionary biology is amazing to me. It means that they really were sort of clueless about, or simply didn't care about, diversity within the field. And I think it was probably that latter thing. But I still am happy that I went to Michigan, because I can definitely trace the scientist that I became because of my experiences in the training that I got in the department of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Michigan, and also my consciousness being raised while I was at Michigan with regard to Black Students Union and the Black Action Movement, which I helped lead, and the Graduate Employees Organization contract negotiations, which I helped lead. And so I was transformed by my time at Michigan. And again, the details are in the book, so I'm not going to continue telling that story.
That's great. I actually kind of want to go to something you kind of touched on. So I don't know how many of the listeners will actually know this, but you are the first African American to earn a PhD in evolutionary biology in the US, which is incredible.
That means the world.
Yeah, it does. It does.
The first person of African descent in the world, because
right.
There's no place anywhere else did it happen.
Right. And so I'm wondering if you would mind sharing maybe some of the challenges you faced on that journey and how you dealt with them. It's
well,
incredible.
Again, truth be told, I would not recommend the way I dealt with my issues to anyone. So I was, the poster child for the toxicity of imposter syndrome, which again, I deal with in intimate detail in the book. I survived, I would say, simply by blind, dumb luck and maybe divine intervention. I dealt with depression. I dealt with alcoholism. My personal relationships were a mess. I struggled, and, I said, dropped out of Michigan and then decided to go back and finish at Wayne State. And literally one day came, my then advisor, Leo Luckenbill, called me into his office and he said to me, Joe, look, everybody in this program knows that you're really smart. But if you don't get in the laboratory tomorrow and start working on your thesis, I am cutting you loose. It was literally on that day that I had to make a decision to stop being my own worst enemy, to stop with the self-defeating behavior and decide that I'm actually going to do this to overcome my fear, because that's really what it was. I was doing everything I could possibly do not to face working on my dissertation because I was afraid. I was afraid I was going to fail. And so on the day I decided that I was going to do the work, everything changed. And when I was done with the experiments, which were the ones that really launched my career as a research scientist, which began in Leo's lab, on the day I presented my doctoral dissertation, it was like a weight lifted off of my shoulders. And I mean, it was like, I could start breathing again because I felt I was choking, suffocating. So I don't recommend people do things the way I do. And one of the things that I've spent my career doing after that was to make sure the students didn't have to go through that.
Yeah, and your work with that has really helped, I think, a lot of people. So I'm wondering how you feel aspects of your identity or background have influenced your work, either your research or the work that you do sort of with race and genetics and misconceptions around race and racism concerning genetics.
That's a core work that scholarly work I've done throughout my career. And again, it was not something I wanted to do. I really would have liked to have had the luxury, like many of my colleagues, to simply focus on basic, life history genetics. But I had no choice because the, ideology that had caused so much pain and suffering in my own life and that of my family and that of my friends, was being produced in the universities I was working in. So, I was now there. I had the training, I had the credentials to demonstrate that this stuff was nonsense. And so in the chapter called America's Biggest Lie, Race and Intelligence, I started down this path because I got a phone call from a professor at Cal State Hayward. Now the university's changed its name. Also, I forgot what it's called now, but it's up in the Bay Area. But Ben Bowser, who's a sociologist, called me and said, have you heard about this new book called The Bell Curve? And I hadn't. And he sort of gave me a rundown about what the book was going to tackle by, Richard Hohenstein and Charles R. Murray. And so I got a copy of it. I read it from cover to cover. Its flaws became obvious to me, someone who was trained in evolutionary and population genetics. And I was actually one of the first people to publish a paper demonstrating how flawed their reasoning was and how bad the evidence they were using to try to make the claim of genetically based differences in racialized intelligence. And that led me down this path of being, the person in place who had the tools, who had the understanding, who had the commitment to take these people on face to face. And so much of my work has been, deploying the science and genetics that we should be doing to study these problems to demonstrate the fallacies of psychometricians and other racists and racialists who, continue to try to, beat that dead horse of genetic differences in race accounting for what we see in society.
Yeah, so our next question is actually related to what you were just talking about. What are some of the ways evolutionary biology has perpetuated racial stereotypes that, you've had to bash down?
Yeah, well, if we start with the history of scientific racism, and one of the things I want to point out, for most people who don't understand this, the history of scientific racism begins in Christianity, not in evolutionary science. And you can read Terence Keel's book, which is an excellent treatment of that. And his book was really stimulated by my discussion of that in The Emperor's New Clothes, which was my first book. But naturalists in the 18th century were special creationists. That was the predominant ideology in Europe. And they were beginning to study the problem of variation. So if you remember that Aristotelian biology had been founded on the ideas of his mentor, Plato, in which variation was considered to be an illusion. And that if we really strip the illusion aside, we would see that, that all things had a core essence. And that was the philosophy of essentialism, which dominated biology for 2 millennia. And so when scientists in the 18th century began to actually study variation and realize, well, it's not really an illusion. Organisms are variable, and they began to describe varieties. And the first of these scientists you probably know well, Carolus Linnaeus, who gave us the biological classification system, binomial system. Linnaeus studied varieties of all sorts. And in 1735, when he published Systema Naturae, it would then be 10 editions of that book until he finally wrote about the varieties of humans. So the 10th edition, published in 1758, Linnaeus describes humans, varieties, and of course, Europaeus is at the top of his hierarchy, okay, and Africans, okay, are at the bottom of his hierarchy, and Asians and Amerindians fall in between. But he does this based upon information he'd received from travelers and colonialists and explorers, because he himself had never left Sweden. He didn't really do any observations of people besides Europeans. And so this idea that God had created these different races and that some of them were better than others, and this was an innate aspect of creation, was then further developed in the 19th century by naturalists who felt that not only were these human races different with regard to their abilities, but they were also different species. And so this was the idea of polygenism. And again, some of the primary scientific founders of biology and anthropology in the 19th century, people like Samuel Morton, people like Louis Agassiz, okay, who was one of the primary forces that helped found American biology, particularly the Comparative Museum of Zoology at Harvard, people like Josiah Gibbs and others were arguing that humans were different species, and they were doing this directly in the service of the slaveholders. In fact, Agassiz made a decision when he came from Europe, because he was recruited to come to the United States by, wealthy interests. He wanted to improve American science and American biology. But Agassiz made a career decision to insert himself into the race debate in America in the 1850s, which was, as it is now, right, the most contentious thing happening in the society. And Agassiz dropped himself right in the middle of this and became the go-to person to talk about the inferiority of the Negro. And it was his thinking that Justice Roger B. Taney used to justify the Dred Scott decision of 1857. So now, how does evolution come into this? Darwin actually felt that humans didn't have biological races. Now, he intentionally did not deal with humans and On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, in part because he didn't want to draw the attention or the ire of the clergy. And when his book was published, it was actually well reviewed, and the British clergy didn't really have a problem with it at all. So it would be a couple of decades before Darwin would officially weigh in on the race question. And that was in his book On the Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which was published in 1871. Now, the difference was that by that time, Darwin was a well-established scientist, leader of the British, scientific society, and he no longer had to fear the repercussions that he did when he was a younger man in 1859. So in Descent, he basically points out that, humans are polymorphic. He didn't really think that the things that were called races were really races in the sense that other species had biological races. But Descent of Man didn't really change the anthropological narrative when it came out, because there were still others who were taking Darwin's ideas and now recasting them in support of racial science. So the first of them is someone you undoubtedly have heard of, and that's Herbert Spencer, who is the primary architect of what was called social Darwinism. And as I pointed out in my first book, The Emperor's New Clothes, Spencer's ideas had absolutely nothing to do with natural selection by, evolution by the means of natural selection, as outlined by Charles Darwin. Okay, Spencer came up with this whole new theory of his own, but he did it to justify society and the status quo with regard to the wealthy, the powerful. It wasn't really directed at race so much as it was class, but it certainly supported racist ideas. And then, of course, in the 1920s and 1930s, we had the rise of eugenics. And again, leading American and other international geneticists played crucial roles, including people like Charles Davenport, who was the president of the American Breeders Association. And this is stuff I cover in my article on the history of American genetics, which comes out in the Rutledge Encyclopedia of Science in December. So, yeah, eugenics, then followed by, life history, J.P. Rushton in the 70s and 80s, and I take on Rushton directly in the 90s. So, yeah, evolutionary science didn't directly require one to come to racist assumptions. Certainly early on, some of the leading evolutionary scientists did, as well as leading geneticists. But in fact, it was evolutionary science that played a crucial role in dismantling the scientific foundations of racism, and particularly starting with the work of people like Richard Lewontin, who demonstrated that there was greater genetic variation within so-called racial groups than between them, and so on. So again, all this stuff I cover in my published writing, so I think we should probably call it on this question as well.
Very good. Yes, that's absolutely fascinating. So you have the unique perspective of somebody who has been around in this, historically racist field for a very long time. So we were wondering sort of how the genetic community has changed during your career, whether that be in ways that are better or worse, and sort of what you have seen the impact on your own day-to-day life as an evolutionary biologist.
I can certainly say that the community of evolutionary and genetic sciences has changed. Now, when we say change, we always have to, put metrics on change. So the support for outright biologic racist ideas is much, much less now than it was when I started in the 1980s. But have those ideas gone away completely? The answer is no. The number of persons who are not of European descent, who are now in the field has grown tremendously over the course of my own career. And I'll give you a really good example of that. So when I first started going to evolution meetings, I also used to go to the Genetics Society of America meetings, but that was never my main society. The Society for the Study of Evolution was my primary society. When I would go to those meetings, when I first became a professor, I would make sure that I would go through and meet every African American or Latino student at the meetings. And I could do it in the course of 3 or 4 days. 2018, I was at the Society for Study Evolution meetings in Portland, Oregon, and I literally could not meet all of the Black and brown people at that meeting. There were so many that I just sort of gave up. And that's a good thing. Okay, because that means in the 30 years or so of my career, the numbers have grown so much that we have critical mass that we didn't have before. So that's certainly important. The number of students I've worked with directly has been a large contributor to that, and those students have had students. And so now I'm coming into contact with grandchildren, people who are the students of the people that were my students. So that's, I think, positive. And certainly, things like you're doing here, Blacks in Genetics, we could have never done that in 1980. Okay, Blacks in Evolution, there's a similar group, could have never done that in 1980. So now there are enough people to do these things. Blacks in Micro, couldn't have done that back then. So we're making progress, but we still have a long way to go. If we will look at the data with regards to the number of PhDs being awarded to Black and brown people, it's still 3-6%. So, and that's not enough considering we're about 22% of this society. So clearly more work has to be done, but we have made tremendous progress. And by our numbers, people earning terminal degrees, deciding to go into careers in science, some of them choosing faculty careers, some going into industry, some going into government. And that's good, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, so I think you're bringing up a really great point about we have all this focus, like our metrics are often around like how many awards or how many actual people are getting these positions or these degrees. But something that I've personally been thinking a lot about is what are we doing to serve those communities when they've already joined our genetics evolutionary biology committee? What are we doing to keep them? So I was wondering, from your perspective, what are some ways that our existing community can support each other and continue to grow?
I think you guys have, by your own actions, have shown what needs to be done. And that's networking people together to support each other as you move forward through these stages of your career. The hardest thing, when I began was, a sense of feeling alone, and thinking there was, very few and nobody out there. So by creating the networks you're creating, and also, we didn't have the tools, and I mean by this, technical tools that you now have to continue networking. For example, a Zoom call in the 1980s. I mean, what? I mean, it was over the telephone. Now you can get 50 people together on the screen, talking to each other from all over the world. So these advances help you with regard to being able to form and retain those networks and to grow those networks. And I think that's the most important thing that has to happen. Also, because time has passed, folks like me are now beginning to be in positions of influence within professional societies, within, for example, universities. Paul Turner was chair of evolution and ecology at Yale for a number of years. People are now, I was an academic dean, associate dean for research for 15 years, and so on. So by being in positions of influence, we're now capable of, holding these institutions accountable for what they're doing and what they're not doing. So again, things are moving in the right direction. But at the end of the day, it really does come down to, what your attitude is with regard to the science you're doing. So I've outlined that in a paper that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with my good colleagues Shirley Malcolm, Maureen Kearney, and Gilda Berabino. That paper was published in March, and it's called Inequality in Science and a Case for a New Agenda. And what we outlined there is that, one of the reasons why we're not retaining Black and brown people in science is because the agenda of science is really not helping Black and brown people. So if that's what we want, then we need to change what the scientific enterprise and science societies are doing so that Black and brown people are more likely to want to be part of it. And so that's really a task I lay on you guys, because you're going to be the activists who make the difference, who make the change. And what us older folks can do is to help give you guidance and support as you go about doing it.
And I have to say, you have definitely been one of those people doing that. So this next section is really just to spotlight some of the really incredible projects that you have coming out. So we're kind of wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about what prompted or inspired you to write the history of American genetics.
Well, I was approached because it wasn't really something I wanted to do. But the editor asked me if I would be willing to do that. And I said, yeah, I mean, this is an important thing to do. And one of the things I feel I didn't do a good job on in that piece is really documenting the role of historically Black institutions with regard to genetic research in the early portion of the 20th century. Now, I couldn't really find a scholarly work that had addressed that. And so there's a charge that I lay out to you guys, because I'm not saying that history doesn't exist. I'm just saying that nobody has wrote on it in a definitive way yet. And it would be nice to know, because a lot of the historically Black institutions had agriculture schools, and agriculture was a driving force in the early history of genetics. And so I'm sure that those people were there, but their work probably hasn't been, chronicled in the way the work at the big ag stations like, the Michigan School, which became Michigan State, work. So that's work that I would like to see taken up.
Yeah, that's a pretty good call to action, Alex. Maybe we'll think about that. So in one of your books, Racism, Not Race, you tackle some of the really common questions concerning race and genetics in like a really fun Q&A style. And so I'm curious how your newest book, A Voice in the Wilderness, sort of uses evolution and genetics to like take a deeper dive into race and racism.
Yeah, it does that. I'm just going to tell you, it does that. I mean, some of the chapters, to give you a sense how I did is write the book. I can't remember the chapters in it. So let's go back to the table of contents. Yeah, so here we go. Table of contents. Help me out. Introduction. So the first part of the book sort of is mainly biopic, but then the second part takes on those big questions I was talking about, such as in chapter 7, America's Biggest Lie, Race and Intelligence. Okay. Chapter 8, a book that should be read by everyone, is the story of how I came to write The Emperor's New Clothes, which is the history of racial thinking in the Western world. Chapter 9, Relax, Evolution is a Fact, but it doesn't tell us anything about the existence of God. Now, this chapter is really important with regard to being able to stimulate interest in careers in evolutionary science from African Americans, who are and have been the most religious group in the United States. And what I try to point out in this chapter is that you can be a person of faith and you can study evolution, and you don't have to choose. And unfortunately, a lot of evolutionary biologists have militantly advanced the you have to choose science versus religion path, which guarantees that Black students aren't going to want to join you. And so I take on that false trope directly in that chapter, recognizing the significance of dealing with that with regard to drawing more African Americans to study the field. Chapter 10, Evolution, Sex, and Gender, in which I take on the myth of the gender binary from the point of view of the evolution of sex, which is one of the biggest problems that evolution has ever been deployed to solve. And I think evolution has done a really good job in solving the evolution of sex and demonstrating that what we call gender in humans is not the same as biological sex. Okay, chapter 11, Homage to Santa Rosalia, or All Hail the Pandemic, which describes the tremendous diversity of the microbial world and how and why, or why and how the way we are living is guaranteeing that we're going to have more dangerous and more destructive pandemics. And that if we don't act now, we literally could be laying the foundation for our extinction as a species. Okay. America's Biggest Lie, Slight Return, because it's such a big lie, you couldn't do it in just one chapter. So we had to devote 2 chapters to the book. 13 is Evolution in Silico, in which it examines how computational evolution, particularly genetic and evolutionary algorithms, are used to solve complex problems in engineering. And finally, the evolutionary science of social justice, in which I make the argument that, in fact, we evolved to behave better in just societies. And so much of the sociological pathology that we're experiencing results from the fact that our societies are so unjust. And once again, making the argument that if we don't fix this, we are guaranteeing the extinction of our species. So that's sort of a voice in a nutshell.
It sounds incredible, and I'm very much looking forward to that book coming out.
It's actually, I was going to say, it's #1 today on Amazon with regard to creationists.
Ooh.
Now, I'm only saying that because I just don't think there are that many books dealing with creationism, so it's probably easy to be #1.
Great. Well, I think that was all the questions we had for you.
Yes, those were all of our questions. We just
Mhm.
wanted to say thank you again so much for joining us today. We will put links to all of the books that you mentioned in the description of this video. So definitely be sure to check out the books and articles that were brought up during this discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Graves, for joining us. And we're looking forward to the rest of Big Week.